They swept the desert for 3 days. Drones dragged their mechanical eyes across every collapsed rooftop, every crumbled wall, every shadow that dared to pool in the wrong corner of the terrain. The Special Operations Unit, 12 men, best the Army had deployed to this border region in a decade, moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never having truly lost. They believed the ghost sniper was out there, somewhere past the ridgeline, crouched in the dust, waiting to be found. They believed that because the alternative was too unsettling to consider. And so they searched the horizon, methodically, professionally, the way men do when they refuse to question the direction they are already facing. Each time they pushed forward, another soldier dropped. A single shot, clean, no echo, no direction, no warning. Just a man standing, and then a man not standing. And still, they looked outward. Still, they pointed their rifles at the hills. Not one of them considered that the most dangerous person within 100 miles had been walking among them since the first morning, eating from the same rations, breathing the same dust-thickened air, listening to every tactical discussion with quiet, attentive eyes. Her name was Elena Voss, and she had already decided who among them would be the last to die. The border region had no name worth keeping on a map. Locals who once lived there had packed what little they owned and left years before the military arrived, reading the landscape the way animals read a storm, not with analysis but with the older intelligence of creatures who understand that certain environments are not negotiable. What remained was geography stripped of everything: soft, jagged ridges, salt flats that cracked like old skin underfoot, abandoned infrastructure half buried in drifting sand, the empty outlines of a life that the desert was in the process of reclaiming. Streets that led nowhere, buildings that held only the memory of the people who had built them. The kind of place that rejected human presence and made no apology for it, that was indifferent to military operations and collateral damage and tactical objectives in the way that stone is indifferent to the disputes of the creatures living on its surface. It was here that the United States Army's Forward Command had established a temporary operating base, a cluster of prefabricated structures surrounded by blast walls, the whole compound sitting exposed in a valley that offered excellent sightlines in every direction, which, as it happened, worked both ways. Captain Daniel Riker had arrived 3 weeks earlier with orders to locate and eliminate the Ghost Sniper, a designation given by intelligence analysts who had run out of better explanations for 43 dead soldiers across 2 months of operations. 43. No repeating location. No consistent time of day. No pattern that surveillance could isolate. The kills stretched across 60 miles of operational territory, each one precise, each one leaving behind nothing recoverable, no shell casings, no identifiable trajectory, no witnesses who had seen anything useful before the shot. Intelligence offered profiles. Profiles offered theories. Theories offered nothing. Riker had read every file and arrived at the same conclusion he always did. The enemy was a problem, and problems were solved by superior force applied with sufficient confidence. He was 38 years old, a decorated officer with a reputation for results, and he had never once considered that confidence itself could be a liability. The unit assembled on day 1. 12 soldiers, a signals specialist, and a medical support attachment, one person, a woman who had been added to the roster 48 hours before departure with minimal documentation and no combat record worth reviewing. Elena Voss, 29 years old, according to her file, trained field medic. 2 years of NGO work in conflict zones prior to enlistment. Riker had glanced at her photograph and her sparse credentials and moved on. She was support staff. She carried a medical kit and a sidearm she had never, according to any record, discharged in the field. She spoke rarely. When she did, her voice was flat and measured, the kind of tone that registered as fatigue rather than discipline. She kept her gear organized with a neatness that was almost clinical, and she had a habit of sitting with her back to walls, her eyes scanning whatever room she occupied with the slow patience of someone waiting for a specific thing to happen. No one found this unusual. No one was watching her closely enough to find anything at all. The first casualty happened on the evening of their second day in position. Private Cole Hartman, 22 years old, was on perimeter watch at the northeastern barrier. The blast walls were 3 meters high. The gap between panels at the junction point was less than 4 centimeters, a maintenance oversight, logged and never corrected. Cole was found there an hour after his check-in time, a single round through the base of his skull, angled upward at a degree that made every analyst who reviewed the data quietly set down their coffee. The shot had come from inside the perimeter. The trajectory required either a position that no external shooter could have reached, without being detected by 3 separate sensor systems, or a shooter who had not needed to be external at all. Riker looked at the data and rejected the second option before it fully formed. Instead, he ordered a sweep of the surrounding terrain, expanded the drone coverage radius by 2 kilometers, and called a meeting to discuss the likelihood of an infiltration tunnel. Elena sat in the back of the room. She drank from her water canteen and listened and said nothing, and her expression throughout was one of absolute, convincing exhaustion. The investigation of Cole Hartman's death turned up nothing that satisfied anyone. The forensics team worked for 6 hours and produced a report that used the word anomalous 4 times in the executive summary. No shell casing. The angle of entry had been calculated 3 different ways and yielded 3 slightly different results, none of which mapped cleanly onto any position a shooter could have occupied outside the compound. Riker took the report and set it face down on his desk, which was his way of indicating that a document had become inconvenient. He ordered increased watch rotations and told his men that the ghost sniper was clearly more sophisticated than previously assessed. He said the word sophisticated the way some men say cowardly as a substitution. A word that preserved their framework while accommodating a fact that didn't fit inside it. The drone footage from the 2 hours surrounding the time of death was reviewed frame by frame. It showed nothing. The exterior sensors had recorded no thermal signature approaching the perimeter. The motion detectors at the northern barrier had logged 1 alert at 11:47 in the evening, flagged and cleared by the watch team as probable wildlife. A designation that no one had questioned at the time because questioning it would have meant accepting a possibility the watch team was not prepared to accept. The gap in the blast wall had been photographed and measured. The trajectory had been plotted on a physical map with string and push pins, the way investigations are conducted when the digital models refuse to cooperate. The string ran in a direction that pointed, without ambiguity, toward the interior of the compound. Riker looked at the string and the push pins for a long time. Then he said that the angle was probably off and ordered the calculation to be redone. It was redone. The string pointed the same direction. Corporal James Weaver was brought in for questioning that afternoon after another soldier reported that Weaver had been acting strangely. Weaver was 26, had 3 deployments behind him, and had been showing signs of anxiety since the unit's arrival, which, under the circumstances, seemed like a reasonable response to the environment. He was questioned for 2 hours and released without result. The questioning was conducted in a way that assumed guilt and searched for confirmation rather than asking open questions and following wherever the answers went, which meant it produced exactly the level of insight that method generally produces, which is to say very little. Elena treated him afterward for elevated blood pressure and a stress response that had pushed his hands into a visible tremor. She gave him something for the shaking. She told him, quietly, almost as an aside, that sometimes the most frightening thing is not the enemy you can see. She said it like a thought she had forgotten to keep to herself, and Weaver, who was not in a state to analyze subtext, simply nodded and looked at the floor. Later, he would replay the sentence many times in the recovery ward and understand it with the particular clarity that arrives only after the thing that was meant is no longer reversible. That night, a second soldier died. Private Aaron Kessler, 31 years old, shot through a gap between 2 reinforced steel panels at the southern end of the compound. The round had traveled at an angle consistent with a position inside the base. The gap was 8 centimeters wide. Elena was documented as having been in the medical bay at the time of death, treating Weaver's stress symptoms, which had worsened by evening. The log entry was in her handwriting. The timestamp was consistent with the estimated time of the shot, give or take a window of approximately 7 minutes. The ghost sniper, the files said, was somewhere in the hills. The drones went out again at first light. Private First Class Marcus Mason was 24 years old, from a small town in rural Georgia, and he had a daughter named Lily who had just turned 3. He kept a photograph of her taped inside his helmet liner, a picture taken at her birthday party, frosting on her cheek, laughing at something off camera. He looked at it every morning before he put the helmet on, a ritual so habitual he had stopped being fully conscious of it, the same way people stop tasting the water they drink every day, even when the water is the only reason they survive. Mason was not the most experienced soldier in the unit, nor the most tactical, but he was observant in the particular way of people who have grown up needing to read rooms quickly, who have learned early that watching people carefully is a form of protection, that the difference between safe and dangerous is often invisible to everyone except the person paying close enough attention. He had grown up reading his father that way, and his teachers, and later his supervisors. and the men in this unit, and he had developed over time a kind of peripheral attentiveness that operated beneath his conscious processing, a background system that flagged anomalies and filed them away without asking him to stop and consciously notice. It was this system that had been quietly accumulating a file on Elena Voss since the second day. He began talking to her on the third day, in the way that soldiers in distress talk to medics, which is to say openly and without pretense, because the medical role carries a specific permission that rank and camaraderie do not. He told her he was scared. He said it plainly, without the performance of bravado that would have accompanied the same admission to any of the other men. He said he had a little girl back home and he intended to see her again, and he was starting to feel like something about this place was wrong in a way he couldn't name. Elena listened with her hands folded in her lap. She asked him once about his daughter, her name, her age, and when he answered, something shifted briefly in Elena's expression. Not emotion exactly, more like a window opening and then being shut before any air moved through it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at nothing visible to Mason, and then she was present again, measured and still, and the conversation moved on. He would remember that pause later. He would remember it the way you remember the thing that should have told you everything. The pause that was a whole story compressed into 2 seconds that you didn't have the context to read at the time. The flashback lived in Elena's nervous system rather than her memory. It did not come as images. Precisely, it came as sensation, as the specific weight of a small body that had gone wrong and slack, as the smell of smoke that had absorbed into her skin so deeply that for months after she imagined she could still detect it regardless of where she stood or what she washed herself with. She had been a school teacher, elementary grades, in a village of approximately 400 people, a village that had the misfortune of being situated 2 kilometers from a site that certain parties had decided was strategically significant for reasons that had nothing to do with the 400 people living nearby. The military operation that destroyed it was logged as a targeting error. The phrase collateral damage appeared in the official documentation. Her husband's name did not appear in any documentation. Her daughter's name did not appear. 3 weeks after the strike, a representative from an unspecified branch of the government visited the survivors' temporary housing and explained, with genuine apparent regret, that the records of the incident were sealed under national security protocols. Elena had sat across from him at a folding table in a processing facility and said nothing. She had already decided, by then, that words were not the appropriate tool for what she intended to do. In the metal box at the bottom of her pack, the one she kept locked and positioned beneath a false floor of medical supplies, there were photographs. 12 photographs, each one a face. Riker's was there, second from the left in the top row. As of that morning, 7 of the 12 had lines drawn through them. The unit moved into the abandoned town on day 4. The tactical rationale was sound enough. Drone imagery had detected what might be a shooting position in a 3-story building at the eastern edge, and Riker had decided that pressing forward was preferable to remaining stationary and continuing to absorb losses. The town had once been a market center. There were still signs on storefronts, faded to near illegibility, advertising goods that no one had sold in years. Sand had reclaimed the ground floor of most buildings. The main road was impassable by vehicle. Radio contact became intermittent almost immediately upon entry, the stone and metal construction of the buildings interfering with signal in ways that the communications specialist could not fully correct. Elena walked near the center of the formation, pack on her back, rifle slung but not raised. She noted the positions of each team member. She noted the points where the group would naturally separate. She noted where the light fell and where it did not. When Private Diego Torres was separated from the group in a sudden windstorm and found 40 minutes later with a round through his forehead in an alley 3 blocks from the main formation, Riker did something that Elena had anticipated and Mason had feared. He split the unit into 4 groups and ordered simultaneous sweeps of separate sectors. Elena said, clearly and directly, that this was the wrong call. She said it the way someone says a thing they know will not be heard as a matter of record rather than persuasion. Riker told her to focus on her medical duties. 3 hours after the team separated, 2 of the 4 groups had taken casualties. The third had lost radio contact entirely, and Mason, watching Elena from across a broken courtyard as she bandaged a wound on a soldier's arm, realized that she had positioned herself perfectly at every point of danger. She had been adjacent to the action but never inside it. Never quite exposed. He told himself he was imagining things, And he was wrong. Mason began watching her the way he had watched his father in the years before things at home went bad, with the combination of hope and dread specific to someone who is building a case they do not want to be right about. He noted that she disappeared for periods of 4 to 8 minutes preceding 3 of the 5 confirmed kills. He noted that her boots were a match, in rough size and tread pattern, for prints he had found near the collapsed building that intelligence had flagged as a possible sniper nest. He noted that she never seemed lost, never seemed uncertain about routes through the town, never hesitated at intersections the way the other soldiers did when the drone maps and the physical reality failed to align. And on the night of the 6th day, when insomnia and the specific voltage of a suspicion that refuses to be dismissed drove him to follow her through the basement corridors beneath a former municipal building, he watched from the doorway as Elena Voss, in total silence, with the practiced economy of someone who has performed the same action several thousand times, assembled a rifle from components that she carried in individual pieces distributed through her medical kit. The scope was the last piece. She set it in place and the weapon became coherent and unmistakable, and Mason's blood became something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She said his name without looking up from the rifle. She said it evenly, conversationally, the way you address someone whose approach you have been tracking for the last 3 minutes. Mason did not move. Elena finally looked at him, and her expression was not guilty and not frightened and not angry. It was tired, the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. She set the rifle down across her knees. She said, "Sit," and something in the tone, not a command exactly, something closer to an offering, made him do it. She told him about the village. Not everything, not all at once. She told him the version that was reducible to facts, because the full version required access to sensory memory that she had decided years ago was private in a way that nothing else was. She told him about the strike. She told him that the operation that destroyed her village had not been a mistake. She told him that it had been a deliberate action to eliminate witnesses to a weapons transaction that had enriched several people at multiple levels of command, and that the documentation of the operation had been altered retroactively, and that every inquiry into the incident had been redirected or buried. She told him that Riker had been the ranking officer on the ground. She did not tell him that she had been training for 6 years. She did not tell him who had trained her. She only said that when every legitimate route closes, people build their own roads. Mason sat on the concrete floor and looked at the rifle in her hands, and then at her face, and then at the rifle again. He thought about Lily and her birthday frosting. He thought about Cole Hartman and Diego Torres and the others. And he knew, in the way you know things that complicate your entire framework, that none of them had been innocent exactly, and none of them had been guilty enough to deserve what had happened to them, and that both of those things could be true simultaneously, and that the world did not particularly care about either. He did not run, he did not call for Riker. He sat in the basement with the ghost sniper, and felt the particular vertigo of a man whose understanding of who the enemy is has just shifted 45 degrees, and decided that he needed to know more before he decided anything. The unit that departed the border region 14 months earlier had operated under command authority that extended, through several layers of official distance, to an arrangement that Riker had described in his personal notes as a partnership. The weapons transferred through the valley below Elena's village had been sourced from decommissioned military stock, relabeled, and moved through a logistics chain that required the village's valley route to remain off the official conflict map, which required the village itself to stop existing as a documented settlement. The official targeting authorization cited a suspected weapons cache. There were photographs in the filing system. They showed storage containers that had, in fact, existed, planted 4 days prior to the strike. Riker had signed 3 documents related to the operation. He had been promoted the following year. He had received a commendation for operational effectiveness in a theater that the commendation did not name. Elena had obtained copies of all 3 documents through means that she declined to specify, and she had been carrying them in the metal box along with the photographs, the maps, and the remaining rounds for a rifle that she had built herself in a workshop run by a man named Thomas Garrett, formerly of the Army's Special Forces community, a man who had spent 22 years building the skills that certain categories of mission required, and who had eventually encountered the category of mission that required him to stop. He had walked away with a limp from a vehicle incident that the official record described one way, and that Thomas described, in the rare instances he described it at all, a different way entirely. He lived on a property at the edge of an unremarkable piece of land in the southwest, and he had a workshop, and he had time, and he had a very specific idea about what constituted justice in a world where the institutions responsible for it had demonstrated a reliable preference for protecting themselves. He had found Elena, or she had found him. Neither of them ever clarified the exact sequence, and he had looked at her for a long time and said that he would teach her everything he knew on one condition: that she built something worth building, not just destroyed what was there. She had agreed, and he had taught her, and it had taken 3 years of training that broke her physically repeatedly and never once broke her in the way that mattered. And Thomas had died of a cardiac event 14 months into the operational phase, in the spring, and she had buried him in the field behind his workshop and stood at the grave for a long time without speaking, because she was not a person who spoke to the dead, and then she had kept going. The psychological disintegration of the remaining unit followed the pattern Elena had designed, rather than the pattern of ordinary military collapse. She did not simply create chaos, she engineered specific suspicions. A misplaced radio code that suggested Sergeant Price had been feeding position data to an external party. A doctored message in Corporal Allen's tablet that implied contact with an unknown civilian. Small manipulations, each one individually dismissible, collectively producing an environment in which no one fully trusted anyone, and in which the energy that should have been directed outward was continuously redirecting itself inward. Riker became a compressed version of himself, shorter responses, faster anger, eyes that tracked his own men the way they had been tracking the surrounding landscape. He doubled sentries, and then suspected the doubled sentries. He had 3 soldiers confined to quarters on suspicion of communication violations, and found nothing when he searched their gear, but did not release them because releasing them would require acknowledging the error. The unit's operational effectiveness halved within 48 hours. Mason watched it happen from a middle distance, carrying the knowledge of Elena like a stone in his chest, and one evening he asked her quietly, in the medical bay, while she wrapped a sprain on his right wrist that was not actually sprained, what she expected to exist on the other side of this. She took her time answering. She checked the wrap and said that she didn't think in those terms. She said that people who are doing something because it must be done don't usually think about afterward. She said there is no afterward, not for her, not for this, and her voice, when she said it, had the flatness of a statement rather than a confession, a fact acknowledged rather than a wound displayed. Mason looked at her hands on his wrist and thought about all the people those hands had healed and all the things those same hands had done from 800 meters away, and felt the profound cognitive discomfort of a human being who has discovered that the categories they rely on are insufficient for reality. Riker found the village record on the morning of the 8th day. He had been running background checks on every member of the unit, a paranoid sweep that he framed as security protocol, and he had reached Elena's file and followed a thread that the original vetting process had not, because the original vetting process had been conducted by someone who had every reason to make sure Elena's background stayed clean. The village name, the date, the casualty figures. He cross-referenced them against the operational log he had kept in his own private archive, encrypted and backed up in 3 locations. The kind of meticulous self-protection that guilty men practice as a reflex. He sat with the information for 2 hours. He did not go to Mason. He did not call a briefing. He called 2 of his most trusted soldiers, men with more loyalty to him specifically than to the institutional mission, and told them that there was a situation requiring immediate containment, and he used a word for Elena that he had never used for a person before, and the 2 soldiers did not question it. Elena was already gone from her cot when they arrived to detain her. She had left her medical kit, opened and partially emptied. She had left the metal box, closed. She had left, on the folding table beside her bed, a single photograph. It was a picture of her daughter, age 4, in what would have been the following year, a year that had not happened. She had printed it from a photograph taken 3 weeks before the strike. She had been carrying it for 6 years. She left it there for Riker specifically, because she wanted him to understand, before the end, exactly what the accounting was. Riker picked it up and understood, and set it back down, and his hands were not entirely steady when he did. The trap he set was simple and visible in the way that only a trap set by a man who believes his opponent's intelligence is less than his own can be. He isolated a building at the town center, and spread disinformation through the remaining soldiers' channels, suggesting that he had evidence of Elena's position, that she was cornered, that the operation was nearly complete. He positioned himself in the building with his 2 loyal soldiers and waited. Elena came. She came in through an entrance that should not have been accessible, through a ventilation structure that Riker's sweep had not identified because his maps of the building were 2 years out of date. She came in from below, and she came in quiet. and she stood in the room before any of the three men registered her movement. Riker told her to put the rifle down. She held it across her chest and looked at him with the same flat patience she had maintained for 8 days, and she said, "You've been describing yourself." He said that he was following orders. She said that orders are not a place where moral weight disappears. They are only a place where people pretend it does. Riker said that the village was necessary. Elena said that necessity is the story we tell after we decide what we want to do. Mason was there. He had followed Riker's movement, had intuited the setup, had arrived from a different corridor 30 seconds before Elena, and he stood at the room's edge and felt the same 45-degree shift multiplied, because now Riker was looking at him with calculation, and Mason could see in Riker's eyes the specific arithmetic of a man deciding whether a loose end is worth the administrative complexity, and he understood that he had never been a person to Riker, he had been an asset, and assets could be written off. Riker said that the village situation was unfortunate. He said that sometimes operations produce results that are not ideal. He said that Elena had killed 11 soldiers who had nothing to do with the village decision, and he was not wrong about that. And all three people in the room knew he was not wrong, and the weight of that truth sat in the air alongside every other truth in the room, and none of them were sufficient to resolve each other. Then Riker said something else. He said it as a kind of explanation, as if the accounting might shift in his favor if he laid out the full ledger. He said the operation was authorized at levels above his. He said the weapons transfer generated funding that had underwritten 3 subsequent operations that had, by certain metrics, saved American lives. He said that the decision to clear the valley route had not been his alone, that he had been part of a chain, that the chain included names he was willing to provide in exchange for his life. He said this to Elena directly, looking at her rifle. Elena was quiet for a moment. She said she already had the names. She said she had been building the documentation for 4 years and that it was stored in 5 locations that would become accessible to 3 separate journalists if she failed to send a specific signal within the next 36 hours. Riker processed this. It took longer than it should have, which told Elena something about how accustomed he was to being in environments where leverage was his to hold. Then he made the decision she had been waiting for. He raised his weapon, not at her, at Mason, and Mason took a round through the upper left chest before he fully registered the movement, because that is how it works when a person with Riker's training decides to act. There is no visible intermediate step between intention and result. Elena moved. For the first time in 8 days, she moved with her full capacity, without concealment, without the governed pace of a woman performing exhaustion. She moved the way Thomas had taught her to move, which was to say she moved as though there were no separation between deciding and doing, and the 2 soldiers flanking Riker were neutralized before either of them had finished processing what was happening in the room. Riker ran. He was not a coward. He ran because running was tactical, because he had a helicopter on standby 2 blocks away, because he had used escape routes in worse situations than this and survived every time. He ran the way men run when they have always been the predator and have not yet made peace with the inversion. Elena let him run. She went to Mason first. She put direct pressure on the wound and confirmed that the lung had not been penetrated and that the bleeding, while serious, was survivable with immediate intervention. She used materials from a kit that was not her medical kit. That kit had been left on the cot as a decoy, but from a smaller supply she carried strapped below the rifle. Her hands were steady. That steadiness was perhaps the most extraordinary thing about her. In the end, not the shooting, not the patience, not the operational discipline across 8 days of sustained deception, but the fact that her hands were steady when she was treating the man whose survival she had decided mattered, while the man whose death she had planned for 6 years was 30 seconds ahead of her in the storm. She looked at Mason's face, and he looked at hers, and he said somewhat unnecessarily, somewhat urgently, that she needed to go. She said she knew. She put his hands on the wound compress and told him to maintain pressure and not to move, and she picked up the rifle and she went after Riker through the storm. The sandstorm had been building for 2 hours and it arrived fully in the same window as the final confrontation, which was either coincidence or the desert's indifferent commentary on human affairs. Visibility dropped to under 3 meters within minutes. Sound became unreliable, distorted, redirected, absorbed into the static of 100 million particles of moving grit. The world became a close and grinding darkness in which orientation required commitment rather than sight. Riker moved through it using his helmet's thermal system, which gave him shape and shadow but not precise detail, translating the world into a color spectrum that prioritized heat and lost everything else. Elena moved without electronic assistance. She had spent months in Thomas's program training in conditions specifically designed to strip away instrumental dependency, to reduce her to something older and more essential, learning to navigate by the pressure differentials of wind through built structures, by the sound profile of footsteps on different surfaces, by the way air displaced differently around a human body than around a wall or a doorframe. Thomas had said in one of the last training sessions before he died, the environment is always talking. The question is never whether it's saying something. The question is whether you have learned to stop assuming you already know what it means. She listened. She tracked Riker across 4 blocks of rubble and broken stone, staying always one lateral axis ahead of where he thought she was, and when she heard the helicopter's rotors begin a sound that cut through even the storm's grinding white noise with the authority of mechanical power, she climbed. The building was 3 stories and partially collapsed at the eastern face, and she went up the western exterior using handholds she had identified 2 days prior when she had walked this ground as a medic, taking note of evacuation routes, carrying her rifle in pieces and her purpose in a compartment behind her eyes. She reached the roofline as the helicopter cleared the adjacent structure and swung north, climbing fast, the rotors pulling it up and away with the urgency of a machine carrying a man who believed he had once again beaten the accounting. She could see Riker through the cockpit glass. He was looking forward. He was not looking back. She calculated wind speed, bearing, the helicopter's rate of climb, the deflection at this distance, in this air density, the scope's compensation at the outer edge of reliable engagement range. She had made this shot in training at a slightly greater distance in cleaner conditions. She had made a variation of it in the field twice. She controlled her breathing to a rate that most people could not sustain under any conditions, let alone on a crumbling rooftop in a sandstorm, and she fired once. The round traveled through the storm and the space between 1 second and the next, and the cockpit glass became something else, and the helicopter's path changed, and Riker's account of the world ended. Mason was alive when the relief helicopter arrived. He had maintained pressure on the wound with both hands for 40 minutes, which the medics who treated him told him later was the primary reason he was still breathing. He was airlifted to a forward surgical facility, operated on successfully, and transferred to a recovery ward where he spent 9 days staring at the ceiling and thinking about things that did not resolve into clarity no matter how long he looked at them. He was debriefed 3 times by 3 different people from 3 different agencies, each of whom had slightly different versions of what they wanted him to say had happened, and each of whom arrived in the same kind of civilian clothing that is meant to suggest informality while communicating the opposite. The questions were framed carefully, as questions of consequence always are framed to make certain answers easier than others, to create rhetorical structures that guided the respondent toward a preferred destination. Mason recognized the architecture because he had seen it applied to other people throughout his life, and he navigated it the way he had learned to navigate difficult rooms, by staying close to the literal and far from the interpretive. He said the same thing every time. There were contacts, there was an engagement, the ghost sniper was neutralized, Riker was killed in action, the remaining unit took casualties consistent with a direct engagement with an organized hostile force. He said this accurately and incompletely, which is to say he told no lies and communicated almost nothing of substance, and the people debriefing him accepted it because the alternative was to pursue a line of inquiry that would have required them to ask questions about Riker's command history that several people at several levels of oversight would have preferred not to see asked in any official forum. The official report closed the ghost sniper file. The entity designated as a hostile sniper of unknown nationality and affiliation was recorded as killed in action. Evidence of termination confirmed by the cessation of all subsequent hostile fire in the operational area. The report did not name Elena Voss. Her service file was flagged as incomplete due to medical support personnel being listed as among the casualties in the engagement. Her photo was placed in an administrative archive. No one followed the thread. The thread was thin, and the people who might have pulled it had sufficient reasons not to, and the institutional preference for resolution over accuracy prevailed, as it generally does, and the file was closed, and the designation Ghost Sniper terminated was entered into the system, and no one looked at it again for a long time. Mason was discharged 6 months later, medically, for reasons related to the chest wound and a hearing loss in his left ear that the military's doctors attributed to combat exposure and that Mason attributed, privately, to standing in a room where 2 men died in rapid succession at close range, which is the kind of event that alters the architecture of a person's auditory system in ways that no amount of medical intervention fully reverses. He drove home to Georgia in a used truck that needed a new muffler, a long drive that he did mostly in silence because the radio felt intrusive, and he watched the landscape change from the flat severity of the highway to the green humidity of home, with a feeling he could not entirely name, not relief, not sadness, something more complex and less resolved than either. Lily ran to him from the porch of his mother's house before he had fully stopped in the driveway, her feet on the steps and then the path and then the gravel. And he stepped out of the truck and picked her up and held on for a long time. And neither of them said anything because she was 3 and did not have words for what she was doing, and he was 24 and did not have words for what he was feeling. And the silence between them was the only kind of silence in a long time that felt clean. He thought about Elena most nights. Not obsessively, it was not that kind of thinking, not the intrusive repetition of trauma, but the quieter, more persistent return to a question that has no resolution. He thought about her the way you think about a problem in mathematics that you know has an answer but that your existing tools are insufficient to derive, and he understood that the insufficiency was not a failure of intelligence but a structural feature of the tools themselves, of the categories available for understanding human action in extreme circumstances. He thought about Cole Hartman. He thought about Diego Torres. He thought about the others, men who had been doing a job, men who had operated within a system that had compromised itself long before they arrived in that desert, men who had not built the structure that had produced the operation that had destroyed Elena's village, but who had functioned as components of that structure and had benefited from its protections. He thought about Riker's face in that room, and the arithmetic in his eyes, and the round that had been meant to close Mason's own account. He thought about what Elena had said in the basement, not for those people, not for this, and he understood it, and understanding it did not make it simpler or cleaner, only more complete. He lived with it the way people live with things that do not resolve, by putting it in a room inside himself and keeping the door closed most of the time, and on the nights when the door opened he sat with it until it closed again, and he did not ask for it to be different than it was. The official documentation remained stable for 8 months. Then a colonel named Harris Whitfield, attached to a logistics command in a city 3,000 miles from the border region, was found in his car with a single round through the driver's side window, the angle consistent with a position at distance, no casing, no witnesses, no electronic signature. The weapon and the shooter were recorded as unknown. The investigation produced a report that used the word anomalous twice. Whitfield's name was in a set of financial records that had been provided, anonymously, to 2 journalists and 1 international accountability organization 7 weeks prior. The records documented the weapons transfer. They included 3 signed authorization forms. They included testimony, transcribed and notarized, from a source whose identity was protected under protocols that the accountability organization declined to specify. The records created what investigators later called a significant structural problem for several people in positions that made them very interested in ensuring the problem did not grow. It grew. 4 months after Whitfield, another name from the same chain, then another, each death, clean, unreachable, impossible to attribute, each preceded by a document release that connected to the Valley operation, to the village record, to the accounting that had begun 6 years ago on a day when everything Elena Voss had been was taken from her in 40 seconds of misdirected fire. The world could not see what it was watching because it could only look at the horizon. It could only look at the distance, at the hills, at the shadows in the terrain, because the assumption was always that the threat came from out there, from the external, from the enemy who wore an identifiable face. The assumption cost them every time. It cost them the way all assumptions cost you, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in the accumulated weight of things that were there the whole time, visible in plain sight to anyone willing to look in the direction they had already decided was safe. Somewhere the geography was not recorded, the city was not named, the rooftop was like every other rooftop on every building in every country where the architecture of damage has the same general language. A woman stood at the edge of a parapet with a rifle resting across her forearm and the wind moving the cloth around her head and shoulders in the particular way that wind does when it is not yet decided about direction. Her face was not visible from below, or from the street, or from any angle that a person operating at ground level could occupy. The city moved beneath her traffic, voices, the ordinary friction of a population going about the transactions of a day that would, for at least one of them, end differently than anticipated. She was not an anomaly up there. She was, to anyone who happened to glance upward, which almost no one did, simply a shape against a pale sky, unremarkable, inert, the kind of presence that the eye slides over because the eye is always looking for the obvious and the obvious is always at eye level. Her stance was patient in the specific way of someone who is not waiting for something to happen but rather observing something that is already in process, who understands that the significant event has already been set in motion and that what remains is only the formality of its completion. Below her, in a lit office on the 7th floor of a building that fronted a public plaza, a man who had signed his name to certain documents was working late. He had a reputation for working late, which his colleagues understood as dedication and which was, in fact, a preference for the hours when the building was quiet and the number of people who might observe him doing certain things was reduced to a manageable size. He had not thought about his window in a long time. The window was on the north face of the building, facing a plaza, and beyond that a residential block, and beyond that nothing of operational interest, which was the assessment of the security review conducted when he had moved into the office 3 years prior. The review had been conducted by competent people who had thought correctly about all the standard vectors, and had not thought about a rooftop at 500 meters because 500 meters was considered a distance that required extraordinary capability, and extraordinary capability was considered rare. She had thought about it. She had been thinking about it, in one form or another, for longer than the man in the office had been significant to anyone except himself, thinking about the window and the angle and the distance and the specific entry record that connected his signature to 3 others and all 4 signatures to a chain that terminated in a valley where 400 people had once had a village and then had not. The wind moved. The cloth moved. The rifle did not. They always searched the horizon. They always expected the threat to carry a distance, to arrive from the beyond, to announce itself by the logic of approach. They never thought to ask who was already in the room. They never thought to look at the quiet person in the corner, the one who moved in all the right places, who spoke in the right register, who offered the right kind of unremarkability. They never thought, not once in all their training and all their operational experience and all their institutional confidence, that the ghost was not hiding, that she had never been hiding, that she had been standing among them the entire time, watching them search for her with calm, patient eyes, and waiting with the absolute unhurried certainty of someone for whom time is no longer a limit but a resource for the precise moment when the last person who needed to understand something finally understood it, which was always, without exception, too late for it to matter.